All right, so we're going to continue from the end of the last section of the chapter, where we were talking about behavioral genetics and all sorts of different components of genetic testing, genetic engineering, and some of the directions that these in the important spaces these are headed, how you can assess the relationships between personality and religiosity, their relationships to genetics. And if you think about it, our genes, determine aspects of our phenotype, but then we also have all of these environmental and experiential contributions. And so, but our personality and aspects of how we approach the world is an aspect of an outward facing phenotype. And it's just not something that's visual. It's a little bit more in terms of personality. And so there's nothing to say that you would only have like phenotypic expressions, or have the genes affect just how you look. It's also going to, of course, have the effect of how you're going to interact with the world and some of your expectations and things like that. So now, getting back to some of the beginning pieces of looking at the relationships and early observations that led to some of the theories underlying evolution, the looking at how so basically taking a step backwards and sort of looking at some of the initial research into aspects of genetic and phenotypic relationships, then we're going to take a step back and quickly return or revisit Charles Darwin. And so I won't go into so much here. The textbook gives a nice little summary, and but it really delves more into what happened on the voyage and his observations, and gave a little bit of the background that then led to the presentation of natural selection as the theory of evolution. And so now natural selection is basically the dominant theory of evolution, of how we've evolved. And it's sort of this mechanistic, natural selection is the mechanism, shall we say, of evolution. And so looking then as this potential mechanism, this mechanism so far has just been nature. But then now what happens also when humans have started to control breeding and things like that were previously primarily left up to nature. So adjust this here. All right. So natural selection has basically a number of postulates that are basic core elements that need to be present. And so and that when you have all these elements present, then you're going to have natural selection and evolution will result. So postulate one, you need to have variation within the population. So there needs to be sufficient variance in all aspects of the phenotype and even elements of the genotype. Otherwise, if you don't have sufficient variance, then you're going to have basically some of the inbreeding effects that that you don't have sufficient variance, that this inbreeding can cause actual issues in replication of, higher level of replication of potential DNA errors, and actually result in worsening the genetic health of the population. So you need to actually have sufficient variation. And with this wide variety, then you have, there's so much genetic diversity. And so much of this genetic diversity would then set up this process for like, okay, well, in this environment, here, this aspect of a genetic trait is highly advantageous, but then this one over here, you have to have diversity in these representations for you to have that dynamicism occur. And then the second piece is that you have to have overproduction, is that there would be production of more organisms than would be needed to sustain the population. And so this is where you basically have balance in the ecosystem. And evolution, natural selection, they ensure aspects of that balance. And so right now, there's oftentimes that we actually have to try to correct some of those imbalances, where you would have, hunting for overbred, not overbred, for overpopulous deer, and certain types of wildlife that when you have this sort of exploding population, that also causes problems because they don't have any of their natural predators. So you have to have an element of this excess. And in this excess, then you also have to have competition. So there has to be, again, if you have more offspring than needed to sustain a population, the population can sustain itself within a set, determined basically upon the resources that are available to that population in the current environment that they're in. So if resources are scarce, then you're going to have high, the competition is going to be really high, and that is, there's going to be favoring particular traits that would particularly advantageous, sort of winning in those particularly high competitive situations. So this, the antlers and things like that. And if you don't have competition, then there's not necessarily any reason for one, genes to become more favorable than another, in which case then the population will sort of stay stagnant for a bit and not necessarily have any sorts of shifts in evolution. So here's a class question, just from this, something to think about. So we're talking, here in terms of there must be competition, and one of the elements of competition is that you have these natural pressures on a group. This could be, or population, this could be climate, this could be land, it could be water access. I mean, a huge number of particular regions, disease, so you have these natural pressures that put pressure on particular populations. And at these points of pressure, that's when you're going to have particularly traits that would arise as more advantageous. So we know that nature can kind of put this pressure on, on a population of organisms, but what about societal pressures? Does this have essentially the same effect? Is societal pressure a form of natural pressure? And so in the fact that society is part of the environment that humans live in, and going back to sort of both this nature and nurture element that society has, is sort of a broader element of sort of the nurture element with which groups sort of grow up. And so if then we have these sort of societal pressures that can have these impacts of advantageous traits, and if we have huge societal shifts, those don't necessarily happen at particularly, frequently. A good example would be the Industrial Revolution, which can cause such a huge shift that it might actually adjust some of the traits that would be advantageous. So something like that. It's even possible that, sort of the current space that we are now, with having the internet and social media and this rapid technological advancement and into sort of AI, we may also be at one of these sort of key points where societal pressures are changing, what types of traits are more or less advantageous or something like that. We won't know this, and this is not something, this would be something that would be part of a 100-year span. So don't take this too literally. But just to kind of step back and really think, and so that was sort of a question for the class, or sort of thought probing. Now, next, excuse me, for the fourth postulate, is that there is advantage, that those happen to be able to compete more successfully tend to, on average, live longer and produce more offspring, and thereby pass the traits on that help them survive to their offspring. And so this form of nature selects. I actually began talking about this postulate a little bit beforehand, because I think it's actually pretty important to just even understand sort of like the placement of some of the others and what they lead to, that you're going to have genetic diversity, and you're going to have competition. Then what will arise from that is there of groups, individuals, populations that have genetic traits or behaviors that are advantageous to their survival in that particular context, and that will contribute then to the propagation of their offspring and the propagation of those genes. So, and then just as that, there would also be traits and stuff like that that can be less advantageous. And what is advantageous and less advantageous, can vary based upon context, which is why you can also have species that develop, quite differently, on different areas of, in different areas of the world. And so then here you could see, what this might sort of lead to is that something that's advantageous today might not actually be advantageous in 50 to 100 years. There is, for example, a theory that there's not, sort of, or a possible thought is that that some of the attributes of attention deficit disorder, in terms of a quick responsiveness to stimuli and sort of attentiveness, to other things, sometimes being able to hold multiple pieces in your mind at one time, that way back in the day, those traits might have actually been quite advantageous in a world that was not flooded with stimuli. So thinking back to a slower time, thinking back to hunters and gatherers, thinking back to, to even to, when, everything was just running slower, sort of before modern times, where there's less stimuli, and, and things are acknowledged to take a really long time to do, that some of these traits, might have, not actually been so disadvantageous. But now, in the environment that we are, like heavily stimuli oriented and busy, this expectation that you're supposed to carry multiple lines of, things in your mind at your same time, and that these traits that were once potentially advantageous are less advantageous in this current state. And so that really presents this idea again of that traits are not sort of good or bad or anything like that, because it all depends upon particular elements of context, and that context can vary by individual. And we know that even some traits that have elements of, oh, there's challenges associated with this, also are highly linked with creativity, with artistic thought, with all sorts of elements, that you have the sort of balance of some of the upsides and the downsides. And that's generally the way genes work, and that the environment interacting, and that all the sort of spaces that the person existed within change the sort of the trajectory. So again, traits are, not really good or bad, or phenotypes are not good or bad. And then finally, you have this idea of modification through descent, and that as the environment changes and applies different types of pressures, organisms modify through descent and change through generations. And we have, seen this in a number of ways recently, and most, everybody sort of understands this idea of traits passing down, and that, again, those pieces can be advantageous in one time or context and not quite as advantageous through another. And then again, depending upon the competition and the context, then, these modifications end up being passed down. So, and kind of within this context of advantage and modification, then we have microevolution versus macroevolution. And microevolution is this idea that you can have sort of like bigger changes or more significant things happen that can cause changes over a short period of time. And then macroevolution is that you can have smaller changes, but then over time contribute to sort of substantial change. So it's basically differences in the rate of change, whether it's happening quickly or whether it's happening over a longer period of time. And so this sort of a big question potentially for the class is, are we potentially experiencing any microevolution right now? Are there natural pressures affecting our population right now? Population can mean all humans or a specific group of people. This could be geographic, economics, etc. You can group people based on all sorts of categories of interest, being careful though that some of them are not so relevant. And what might some of these pressures and effects be? So this is just something, again, to think about in terms of how taking a step back and seeing and recognizing ourselves within sort of the context and the environment that we're in, and pausing to kind of look closely at that connection and thinking, okay, well, where are we in this space? Could we be going through something like this? And what potentially does it mean, if anything? So, all right. And next, so looking at some of the physical evidence of natural selection, just to kind of review some of this support. The textbook goes through this pretty nicely. But you have homologous structures, so similarities and sort of build between sort of limb structures, for example. Biogeography, that there can be similar features in some of the same areas. And then you have embryological development, represents evolution, evolution, sort of evolutionary development. I was going to say evolution during development, but and this is actually something that if you look at some of the embryonic and look at particular different species, there are some really remarkable, similarities that sort of go through. And this is highlighting that so much of this initial embryonic space is similar regardless of any sort of species that you are. And that in that sense, and as we learned from some of the epigenetics, that technically even all of the alphabet is the same, that all of these other species, they have the base pairs of the AT and the CG, and it's just that the words that they make are slightly different with those letters than humans. And so so that space, recognizing at one point sort of real differentiation starts to occur in terms of some of the key pieces of like the development of a nervous system, which is present in many, many species. Those elemental things come first. So then we have similar genetics between related species, including retrovirus DNA insertions. And so this is where they talked about some of the similarities between chimpanzees, and that based on some of these retroviruses that are just inserted to genes, inserted into us at particular times, in how these get passed on, and these occur at particular points in time, then we can determine some aspect of lineage and common origins to kind of go back to, okay, we both, humans and chimpanzees, have this. At what point, is there a single sort of species that has it, that then would be something common? So that could be really quite early. That's really, like the evolutionary process. It's clearly that there was, so much that was sort of split, between having that common ancestry, because it's a huge amount of time. But this is how elements of this work. And then of course, the other evidence that we have is that artificial selection changes organisms. You can actually observe this in a quicker period of time, that it doesn't take, our generations. You can observe it in species that have shorter lifespans, and we're pretty much seeing it right now through elements of climate change and through how much humans are changing the geography of the area, that animals are either evolving or or not. We're basically, unfortunately, not surviving. So, all right. The other thing that we have, that you can help support the theory, help support natural selection, is the expression of the emotions in man and animals by Charles Darwin. This was a book that he published after his seminal natural selection book. And so you can find this in looking for mental homology, so similarities, and so giving some of the examples of expressions in humans and other primates and stuff like that. So those elements, and that similar to some key elements of that are shared across different animals. There's ideas that animals can have that express emotions, and that these shared pieces, are elements of sort of common, function, and in closely, especially in closely related species. And then this work was supported by George Romans, and this is a book of anecdotes on the intelligence of animals. And it basically gave rise to the field of comparative psychology, which we have other classes here at UNCC. And this is the study of learning, memory, cognition between different species of animals. And we are learning quite a lot. All right, so now one of the big pieces that we've been going through, all the importance of genes and behavior, behavioral genetics, going into natural selection, and kind of building up this space. And but in line with the importance of all of these observations is the fact that much of the research has been misrepresented, particularly the theory of natural selection, with the idea of making, better humans, and that, natural selection is about nature and the environment sort of engaging in these spaces over hundreds and thousands of years. And but then this field of eugenics started, that was trying to sort of build really inappropriately and not at all advocated by any of the scientists, in some of these original fields, by Charles Darwin or anyone in sort of those spaces. And so we have so this eugenic space kind of evolved of like, well, if this is how natural selection works, then, well, we can take care of this. Humans, we can take care of natural selection. This is basically sort of the process that was sort of taught to us, and we're going to apply it. So, so this was this idea of, okay, if you're making this better human, what are the components of this better human? And then of course, who decides? This is subjective. And of course, who decided are basically the people in, power at that time, like what's a better human? Well, I'm a better human. I'm coming up with these. I'm going to make other better humans, of course, so these things are extended. There's not much of, not all scientists, especially, like back in the day, because right now we actually go through like scientific training and all these types of things. And we have degree programs that verify some of this stuff. Not everybody went and participated in these, but so you can then have this propagation of these biases or beliefs, of what is better. And this, fortunately, the history of it is not, it's not too distant in the past. And so in some parts of it are still pretty alive and well and common today, and in unfortunate ways. So eugenics used to basically be promoted in two ways. You would have positive eugenics, which is promoting high reproduction in individuals with good genes. And so there would be financial incentives, and there would be fitter family contests. I couldn't believe that's when I actually read it in the textbook, because I'm familiar with the space, but that was a new one, where they would literally give awards to the children that looked, like the best and sort of most, fittest babies. And I can tell you, if that's probably where some of this, parenthood, mother comparison stuff came from, we do not need it. We can get rid of it. This is, we should not be comparing our kids to each other. It's just so damaging. And but this is aspects of that, of thinking of just sort of like, oh, this better or more fitted elements. And so this happening on sort of a larger scale with groups of people with particular traits or status. So these would be promoting, the propagation of these groups, subjectively chosen, and that would be positive eugenics, excuse me. Negative eugenics would be promoting the removal of bad genes for human populations. And this includes sterilization, and another, and of course, example is of Nazi genocide and the Holocaust. And so the, actually, let me check to see what slide comes next before I, okay. So in a couple of these things, the history in here is dark, and it is not too distant in the past, and it's probably actually really important for people to understand this and how poorly it was applied. And so this would just be groups that were just not deemed as desirable to their racial and ethnic backgrounds. Black women were sterilized at incredibly high rates. It's again, it's sort of a Black history that we need to try to be more responsible for. And some groups are trying to be more responsible and kind of correct it, but parts of it are a little bit sort of insidious and built into some policies. And so this stuff is awful. And so just continuing and giving a little bit more examples of this. And so how much we need to be wary of making sure that you're understanding some of the principles that you're learning in this class with regards to genetics appropriately. So one of the examples of how this sort of got taken astray that is really quite important is the Binet intelligence test. And this is, basically the origin of sort of some of the intelligence testing that we do right now, in even some aspects of the school testing. And so Alfred Binet developed an intelligence test, and the intentions of this were of the best, to identify and provide support for children struggling in school. It was particularly used to say, okay, here will be problems that we can be used to sort of identify students that just might need some additional support. It was not meant to be sort of evaluative, and it was not any way meant to be a measure of natural intelligence. And this was something that he was explicit in. But, once things are published, what other people can do with it is not as much up to you. Although you can definitely keep on trying, and appropriate channels, say like, this is not appropriate representation of my theory. So this is what happened for Goddard. He basically encountered the Binet intelligence test and began basically applying it to soothe this sort of better human model of eugenics. And so he established an intelligence testing program on Ellis Island with this idea that this intelligence test that was designed for school children and sort of modified and things like that would be able to be used to identify feeble-minded people entering the United States. And so never mind the fact that there were potential language barriers, or that no understanding of cultural differences in approach to questions or anything like that, and really none of the things that are put in place in research right now to actually give any sort of control for sort of these results will be valid and representative. So this was just basically applied and resulted in these selectively these groups that were identified at the time as just being undesirable. And this was Jews, Hungarians, Italians, and Russians. And this resulted in a huge exponential increase in deportations. And in the end, some of this also, again, identifying or sort of saying, okay, well, here we're going to have people in based upon specific sort of criteria of, their contribution, resulted in the Immigration Act of 1924, which restricted immigration from Italy, Latin America, Russia, Asia, and India, because at the time, these were sort of desired, sort of like, okay, how much of sort of this is desirable space. And actually, there was one thing that I wanted to add, and I'm trying to, and this is some of the stuff that the qualifications for this, the Immigration Act, of like being able to continue and to try to get your places there. They're now becoming merit based, and that people are going to be evaluated based upon how they can contribute to the United States. And this is also thought to be sort of a form of some of this inappropriate application of what groups are desirable based upon these particular merit qualifications that are just set by contribution to X. So it is so some of these spaces are still are very much alive today. And so this space has all been leading to really these ethical questions with regards to genetics. All complex human characteristics are an interplay between the environment and biology. There is nothing that is all one or all the other. You cannot link intelligence and genes. That is not the way it works, or even how intelligence works in terms of functioning within an environment or context. There are also all types of intelligence and skills that, and as we know, you can have, extremely smart people, they're now featured in television shows, The Big Bang and stuff like that, are really, really brilliant, but also like kind of like completely not with it in terms of social skills. So just demonstrating these types of there's all sorts of different types of intelligence and skills, and these things are only a part of them is going to be due to genetic influence. Natural selection is also not human selection. In no way is our behavior as humans meant to be something that is going to affect, the or going to kind of emulate the natural selection process for another human group. Um, and then getting back to these merit-based immigration programs, which we talked about. And then what about the sort of risk of modification to the gene pool? So that we're trying to make some of these modifications, but there's not any understanding of what these modifications might do downstream later in life. There was someone that tried to modify genes with regards to making someone sort of more immune for HIV, and it worked, but it shortened their lifespan. You have groups or countries that have basically virtually, like eradicated Down syndrome through genetic testing. But then is that a good thing? Do we want that? Like, but these individuals can make like valuable contributions in all sorts of ways as people. And then what about other conditions? So these are the types of things that really need to be really carefully and thoughtfully considered right now in the time and space that we are in. And so with that, this is the end of the chapter, and your terms are here. And I will see you all next time for chapter 6.